Now, the role of religion in a constitutional democracy is once again in focus, following ongoing discussions around the proposed governance frameworks for religious faith groups. The proposals, linked to the work of the Cultural, Religious and Linguistic Rights Commission, a Chapter 9 institution, are intended to encourage accountability and ethical leadership within faith-based communities, particularly in response to past concerns about abuse and misconduct in some religious spaces. Now, while some view these frameworks as an opportunity for faith groups to strengthen self-regulations, others have raised questions about how such measures relate to the constitutional principle of separation between church and state. As legal and public debates continue, there is growing interest in understanding what these discussions mean for religious freedoms, public trust, and the place of faith in South African society. Joining us to unpack this is Prof. Simangaliso Kumalo, who's a professor of public theology and history at the School of Arts, University of KwaZulu-Natal, and the director of the Center for Constructive Theology. Prof. Kumalo, good afternoon. Thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it. Why is the separation of church and state important, and is an attempt to regulate religious organizations akin to state interference in church?
Not necessarily. It is critical that there is a general and broad understanding of the religious communities that are operating in the country. And because the state has the responsibility of protecting its citizens and also of protecting religion itself, the right of people to practice their religions in the country. It is therefore important for the state to know what's going on in the religious community or within the religious space without necessarily being deemed as interfering. It shouldn't be like that the moment the state wants to know and even influence or participate in the conversations, that should then just be deemed as being interfering and then be dismissed, just like that. I don't think that's where it should start. The state has got the mandate of running the country and protecting religion, especially in a country which is, though it's secular, but it is a religious neutral state which observes and protects the religious freedoms of the people.
Is there at all a need for a religion to be regulated in South Africa, or at least the practice thereof?
Well, generally, there will be an agreement that almost all states in the world guarantees the freedom of religion. But also all states, most states, have interest on how religion is being practiced. Does it protect the fundamental rights of citizens? And also the question of how does the state benefit from the best of contributions that the religious communities can make in society. It is not necessarily something that the state should always be wanting to interfere and following on religions. But if there are issues of concern, then the state has to engage with the religious community. The question of regulating, of coming up with the regulatory framework itself is a process that the religious sector and the religious community at large should lead and participate in it, with the state providing the necessary support to, like all sectors in society. They are not necessarily regulated in absentia and unilaterally by the state, whether you are talking about the health sector, education sector, whatever sector, industrial sector that we are talking about. You also require the stakeholders who are part of these communities to participate and be part, in fact, lead the process and the state can support those processes until it is done at the satisfaction of all stakeholders. Nothing must be imposed.
So why can't the state then support, as you say, a self-regulatory framework? That is to say, religious organizations self-governing, determining what minimum standards of acceptable practice are, and the state supporting it through either endorsement, but not the imposition of a regulator itself.
That's exactly the question that is creating tensions in the country. If you listen, you'd hear the religious sector being concerned and complaining that they have not been included in all processes. The regulation by the state seems to be being imposed and pushed forward at all costs and by any means necessary, without taking the religious leaders, people who are coming from that sector, on board, and also listening more and allowing the experts within the religious space to lead the process and guide the process, and making sure that people are fully on board. That's where the disagreement is at the moment. So generally, it's not necessarily that religious leaders are just wanting the government to stay away from this and not be involved at all. But it's the question of how it is being done, the methodology, the processes, and all the systems that are put in place to enable that. That's where I have seen and have heard people having some kind of disagreement and tension.
Let's talk about what the substance of regulation would actually look like. Let's consider a situation where the state becomes a regulator, or let's say the states, there's some sort of a constitutional provision in our statutory frameworks for an independent regulator, like a Chapter 9 institution, for instance. And they say, hey, listen, there are some things in our Constitution, in our Bill of Rights, which are clear and non-negotiable, and we deem that certain theological interpretations on your part, which translate into certain religious and ritualistic practices, violate part of our Bill of Rights. Let's, for instance, consider a situation where a church believes in a religious leader ordaining a marriage which they have chosen for you, otherwise known as organized marriage. But you, as a member of that church, are compelled to get married, and compelled to get married to the person, this is all hypothetical, by the way, to the person that the religious leader would have chosen for you, against your will. Now, the Bill of Rights would otherwise protect you from that, but the church could say, well, that's our interpretation of religious doctrine and theological interpretations, and therefore you are violating our right to religious practice, and you are violating our right to association. That could be a clear tension, one can imagine, in terms of what the Constitution says on the one hand, and what a religious organization or movement would say their path to righteousness and salvation tells them on the other hand. How would that then be balanced out?
Well, the Constitution of the country is the supreme law, and it is meant to protect people's rights. And actually, there is no sector in society that has a right to violate the constitutional rights of people. And the government has the responsibility of protecting and enabling the protection of people's rights. And sometimes people might not be having the capacity to protect themselves and all that. So the government does have the responsibility of engaging whatever group or in society that seems to be promoting the violation of individual rights or even communal rights of people. And so in that case, there is need for a dialogue, a constructive dialogue, engagement, that says to the people in society and even to the religious communities, you can do this if it protects people's lives and it promotes life, but you can't do things that are against the Constitution of the country. And I don't think religious leaders are just wanting to go all and do whatever they want to do, which is against the Constitution. I've not heard that. What I have heard
Well, I mean, I gave you what seems to be quite a silly hypothetical, right? Which is, in common sense terms, unlikely to ever happen. But we've seen weirder and scarier things in South African churches. Let's consider something a little bit more real, something that we've confronted in religion before. And that is that the South African Constitution guarantees you the right to anti-discrimination, that you will not be discriminated against on the basis of your gender, sexuality, and or your race. But the church does discriminate, at least the Christian church does discriminate on the basis of those things, where certain practices are for the exclusive preserve of certain people. For instance, in some churches, you cannot pursue the pulpit if you're a woman. Now, if the state becomes a regulator, where do they draw the line?
Well, in fact, you are right, Oliver. The question is, even within those practices that you have in society, there is also, you also don't violate the will of the person, what they want to do, because it is people's rights to also join those churches that they decide to join. And it is their right that they participate within the churches themselves to engage and push the boundaries that have been put, that if they feel that those boundaries are working against them. So it is not just a matter of the government coming from above and then saying this is right, this is wrong, this is right, this is wrong. It is a question of saying, yes, what about the people who are in this religion themselves? What are they thinking? What are they saying? What are they following? What are they believing? Are they actually aware that it is their right to be members of that religion or not to be members of that religion if it is oppressing them and this is how they feel? Issues of doctrinal matters are issues of that needs to be engaged by the community of faith themselves. And people agree to that. They cannot be pushed to do things that work against them. It becomes a problem when people are forced. But if people are saying, I'm fine with this, it helps me in a particular way, it might not appeal to people who are outside this community, and I'm happy to be part of it. It's also their right to do that.
Yeah. Now, of course, we know that when rights are being violated, oftentimes there's a requirement on those whose rights are being violated to come forward and say, my rights have been violated. Then the state intervenes, right? But one would imagine that if people's rights are being violated and they don't see that as a violation, but we on the outside see it very clearly as a violation. That is to say, your pastor makes you drink a liter of petrol in the morning before church starts, or have you eat a fistful of grass. You may see that as okay, because to you, the Constitution might not be the supreme law. The Bible and your doctrinal interpretation of it might be your supreme law. We know that that's how people often make the calculation around religion. There would be a requirement on the state to intervene, even if none of those people complained. And that goes a little bit against that separation you said, where people can opt out. These people haven't opted out, but clearly there's need for intervention. Again, creating a very uncomfortable tension.
Yeah, that's true, Oliver. In fact, the point that you are making is even more important because people in religious communities are taught, and through that they are indoctrinated. And it is also a fact, and we've seen it, that at times this indoctrination makes them maybe not to respond to things that they should be responding against, because it works against them. Firstly, the religious communities themselves also have a responsibility to hold one another accountable. Even before you talk about the government intervening into the religious space, religious communities and groups and organizations themselves have a responsibility, because anyone who does something in the name of religion is actually impacting on the rest of the religious community. So they do need to come forward and not wait for government to intervene. The fact that government has to intervene at times is because also religious communities themselves have not acted.
Prof, do we have that level of cooperation across religious denomination lines in South Africa?
We don't. Unfortunately, at the moment we don't, because religious communities themselves are so diverse, and even in terms of organizing one another themselves, they fall into different groups and categories and all that. In fact, that's where the important role of organizations like the South African Council of Churches, KwaZulu-Natal Christian Council, and other Council of Churches and religious communities, as we have had. In fact, Oliver, if you look back in the history of this country, soon after the end of apartheid, there was the IRM, the organization, the interreligious group that was set up in this country that used to have a meeting continuously with the president of the country and the cabinet, continuously to try and deal, how do we live well and allow religion to add value into society so that it's an asset for the development of this country rather than a liability. And those conversations were quite helpful and all that. Maybe there is a need to revisit those platforms that they used to have. So, and also to mobilize the religious communities to have broad agreements of cooperation and collaboration and holding one another accountable. In fact, that is the work that the CRL and others should be doing, working with the religious communities to bring them together, to talk to one another and all that, so that they get into a process that leads to some form of broad collaboration and even a broad regulation, other than maybe coming with a solution of saying, we are now going to regularize you, to regulate you, this is what you can do, you can't do that and all that. I think that there's a problem there. And what I'm proposing and saying now, it's what has been done in most different countries in the world. There is no country in the world that doesn't, that sees religion as a no-go zone. They can't do anything to shape it. But also at the same time, they do not come in to impose. And I think they work with the religious communities themselves, trust their agency as citizens of the country, trust the fact that they also stand, they seek to do what is the common good. They stand for the common good rather than the aim being to disadvantage people.
Yeah, I mean, the question of the common good in South Africa is itself a divisive question. One would imagine that would put quite the asterisk on prosperity gospel, for instance, being preached in some churches, given the socioeconomic conditionalities of South Africa, where a lot of those churches find themselves in. But Prof, we're going to have to leave it there. Really do appreciate it. Prof. Simangaliso Kumalo is from the University of KwaZulu-Natal.